My name is Margot. I have always believed in the life we built. 10 years of marriage, a beautiful son, and an untouchable love. Brian, my husband and best friend, was adored by the world and a voice people trusted. And I trusted him too. Today was supposed to be a rare moment of peace, a day to unwind after work. Laughter surrounded me as friends sipped wine, eager to hear Brian's voice. When my phone rang, his name glowing on the screen, they begged me to put it on speaker. I hesitated, something felt off. But against my instincts, I answered. Then I heard it. Not my name, not the warmth of a devoted husband. Instead, whispers and promises meant for someone else. The room fell silent, my chest tightened, my hands trembled. I stood up, trying to breathe, trying to process. 2 steps, then darkness. I collapsed. I used to believe in fairy tales, not the kind with princes and castles, but the kind where 2 people built a life together. One of trust, loyalty, and unshakable love. That was my life, or at least, that's what I thought. Brian and I were a power couple, admired in our worlds. He was the voice that millions tuned in for. Charming, intelligent, the kind of man who could turn words into art. I was the woman behind grand designs, reshaping spaces into homes that reflected dreams. Together we were untouchable, at least in the eyes of others. We had the career, the status, and most importantly, a love that people envied. At every gala and every public appearance, people would comment on how lucky I was, how Brian adored me, and how rare it was to see a couple still so in love after a decade. The way he spoke about me in interviews, the gentle kisses on my forehead in front of flashing cameras, the stories he told of our son Ethan, as if fatherhood was his greatest achievement. It was the image of a perfect marriage. And I believed it. I let the words sink into my bones, let them become my truth. At home, Brian was different, but I convinced myself it was just the weight of his job. He was busy, always moving, always planning. He carried the exhaustion of a man who gave too much of himself to the world, and I tried to understand that. When he came home late, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his usual, I told myself he had brushed past someone at work. When he forgot our dinner plans, I reminded myself that his schedule was relentless. When he spent more time on his phone, texting with a furrowed brow, I reassured myself that it was just business. I had every reason to trust him. For 10 years, Brian had been the man who held me when I cried, who celebrated my victories, who whispered love into my ear on nights when the world felt too loud. We had built a family, a home filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and Sunday morning pancakes. He was a good father and a good husband. That's what I told myself. And yet, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. The night he came home and hesitated before kissing me, as if he had forgotten that was something he was supposed to do. The weekend he claimed he had an out-of-town meeting, but returned with a distant look in his eyes, as if his mind was still somewhere else. The way he would be so present, so warm, then suddenly retreat, leaving behind a man I barely recognized. I told myself not to be paranoid. I had no proof, no reason to question him. Marriage required trust, and I trusted Brian with everything. My mother used to say that a woman's intuition was never wrong. I had ignored mine for years. The last evening we spent together before everything changed, Brian had been unusually affectionate. He kissed the top of my head as I cooked and wrapped his arms around my waist while I chopped vegetables. He made me laugh, told me he missed me, promised a weekend away, just the 2 of us. It had been a long time since he'd suggested something like that. I remember looking up at him, seeing the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, and thinking, this is what love is supposed to feel like. And yet something inside me whispered, he's overcompensating. I dismissed it. I let myself believe in us, in our family, in the love that had carried us through a decade of memories. I never imagined that the very next day, with a single phone call, that love would unravel before my eyes. I woke up to the steady beeping of a heart monitor, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to the air. The fluorescent lights above me flickered slightly, casting cold shadows against the white hospital walls. For a moment, I didn't remember how I got here. My body felt heavy, my mind clouded. Then a voice, soft but anxious, broke through the haze. Margot, you're awake. I turned my head slowly. It was Olivia, one of the women from the exhibition, her eyes filled with concern. She was still in the sleek black dress from earlier, but her makeup had smudged slightly. Her hair now undone from its elegant style, she had stayed. What happened? My throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper. You collapsed, she said gently, reaching for a glass of water on the bedside table. At the exhibition, the organizers didn't want to cause a scene, so they told everyone you had an emergency and had to leave suddenly. I came with you. I took a slow sip of water, trying to process her words. I collapsed. I had an emergency. The words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's reality, not mine. But then it hit me. The phone call. Brian's voice. The other woman. A sharp pain twisted in my chest, and I felt bile rise in my throat. I clenched my fists against the sheets, trying to ground myself. No, this isn't what it seems. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I misheard. Maybe it was a joke, a misunderstanding. Brian loved me. He loved our family. Margot, Olivia hesitated, watching me carefully. I don't know what you heard on that call, but if you need to talk about it, I'm here. I shook my head quickly. No, it's not what it seems. There must be an explanation. The words felt hollow the moment I said them. Olivia didn't argue. She just gave me a look, one that I had seen before, in women who had learned the truth the hard way. I had to know. I pushed the blanket aside, ignoring the dull ache in my head. Where's my phone? Margot, maybe you should rest. Where is it? My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Olivia hesitated before reaching into her purse and handing it to me. I dialed the number before I could second-guess myself. Ben answered on the third ring. Margot? His voice was cautious, uncertain. He knew. I inhaled deeply, gripping the phone tighter. Tell me everything you know, or I'll make sure your name is in every headline tomorrow. A long silence stretched between us. Then a heavy sigh. They've been together for 3 years. 3 years. I heard the words, but they didn't register. 3 years. I repeated them in my mind, trying to make sense of them, but they felt foreign, like someone else's tragedy. 3 years. That was how long I had been living a lie. 3 years of celebrating anniversaries, believing in his promises, falling asleep beside him every night, completely unaware that he was building a second life behind my back. I forced myself to breathe. Who is she? Ben hesitated, his secretary. I closed my eyes, the world spinning beneath me. Of course, the late nights, the unexplained business trips, the lingering scent of perfume that wasn't mine. It had all been right in front of me, and I had refused to see it. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the deception. The ease with which Brian had looked me in the eyes, held our son, kissed my lips, and carried on as if nothing was wrong. It wasn't just that he had cheated, it was that he had lied so effortlessly. I hung up without another word. Olivia was watching me, waiting. I turned to her, my voice steady, even though everything inside me was breaking. He's been with her for 3 years. She didn't gasp, didn't look surprised. She just reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. I'm so sorry, Margot. But I wasn't ready for sorrow, not yet. I wasn't ready to grieve a love that I wasn't sure had ever been real. Right now, I needed to think. Right now, I needed to decide what came next. I drove in silence. The city blurred past me, neon lights bleeding into the wet pavement as the rain began to drizzle, turning the world into a soft haze. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. The weight of what I had learned in that hospital room pressed down on me, heavy, suffocating. Ethan sat in the back seat, humming softly to himself, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. My beautiful boy, innocent, untouched by the deception that had shattered everything I thought was real. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, the way his small fingers drummed against his backpack, his mind lost in the simple joy of childhood. He didn't deserve this. Not tonight. I pulled into my mother's driveway, the warm glow of her living room lights spilling onto the porch. She opened the door before I even had to knock, her gaze flickering between me and Ethan with quiet understanding. Stay with Grandma tonight, sweetheart, I said, kneeling to kiss his forehead. My voice was calm and steady. I had to keep it that way for him. Ethan looked up at me, confused. But why? We always read stories before bed. I know, baby. Just tonight, okay? I forced a smile. I'll see you in the morning. My mother said nothing. She simply took Ethan's hand and led him inside. But before she closed the door, she met my eyes. She knew. I turned and walked back to the car. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. I had delayed this long enough. The house was dark when I arrived, with only a single lamp in the living room casting a golden glow. The familiar scent of cedarwood and faint traces of Brian's cologne still lingered in the air. I stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind me, the lock clicking into place with an eerie finality. Brian was in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of wine, his body relaxed, unaware. He didn't even look up when he spoke. How was the exhibition? I stood in the doorway watching him, letting the moment. The casual ease in his voice made my stomach turn. How many times had I walked through this door, greeted with that same warm tone, believing it was meant for me alone? How many nights had I stood in this very spot, blind to the truth that had been unfolding right under my nose? I took a slow breath, steadying myself. I know everything. Brian froze. His hand hovered over the wine bottle, his grip tightening slightly before he forced himself to move, to keep the act going. He turned, offering me a confused smile, the one he used in interviews when deflecting uncomfortable questions. Know what? I walked further into the room, stopping just a few feet away from him. The distance between us had never felt greater. Her name is Claire, I said, my voice quiet but sharp. Your secretary. 3 years. His face barely flinched, but I caught it. The slight shift, the flicker of panic before he smothered it. He opened his mouth, then closed it, searching for the right move and the right words to control the damage. Margot, it's not what you think. Don't. I didn't need the excuses. The rehearsed lines, the half-truths are meant to manipulate. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated as I tapped the recording. A voice filled the space between us, his voice, soft, affectionate, whispering promises he had no right to make. Baby, don't be mad. I was just too busy. I'll make it up to you next week, okay? Really? You said that last time too. This time I promise, you're my girl. The moment it ended, the silence between us felt deafening. Brian's jaw tightened, his shoulders stiff. He wasn't scrambling for apologies now. He knew there was no room for them. For the first time since stepping into this house, I saw it. His fear. Not the fear of losing me. The fear of losing his image. Margot, please. His voice was softer now, controlled. If this gets out, my career... And just like that, I understood. The devastation that had been clawing at my chest slowly began to dull, replaced by something colder, sharper. He wasn't afraid of what he had done to me. He wasn't afraid of breaking our family. He was afraid that the world would see the man behind the mask. He was afraid of losing his status. I let out a slow breath, feeling the last remnants of my heartbreak solidify into something unbreakable. You don't love me, I said, watching him, waiting for him to deny it. He didn't. You love the idea of me. You love the status I gave you. Brian said nothing, and that silence told me everything. The silence between us stretched thick and suffocating. Brian still stood there, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as if it could anchor him, as if it could hold together everything that was slipping through his fingers. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. I could see it in his eyes. The frantic calculations, the desperate search for a way out, for a way to rewrite the narrative into something that wouldn't destroy him. He had always been good with words, always knew exactly what to say to charm an audience, to turn any situation in his favor. But now, for the first time, there were no cameras, no adoring fans, just me. Just the woman he had lied to for years. And I wasn't playing along anymore. I took a step forward, my voice even, my gaze unwavering. Tomorrow we file for divorce. His whole body tensed. A reaction so visceral, so immediate that for a second, I thought he might break. But then, just as quickly, he tried to regain control, tried to slip back into the role he had played so well for a decade. Margot, he started, his voice softer now, practiced. Let's just take a moment. You're upset. I understand, but we don't have to do this. I tilted my head, studying him. He still didn't get it. I'm not upset, Brian, I said. I'm done. His nostrils flared. The charm flickered and faltered. The panic bled through. Margot, think about this, he pleaded, stepping closer, his voice taking on that familiar, persuasive tone. We have a life together, a family. Do you want to throw all of that away over a mistake? I almost laughed. Almost. A mistake? I repeated, my voice laced with something colder than anger. You didn't trip and fall into an affair, Brian. You built an entire second life behind my back. 3 years. 3 years of lying, of sneaking around, of coming home to me and our son and pretending like we were enough for you. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his fingers tugging at the strands as if he could pull himself out of this nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. It was reality, one he had created. His desperation sharpened. "What about Ethan?" he said, voice cracking just enough to be convincing. "What about our son?" And there it was, his last card, the one he thought might make me hesitate. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The man I had once loved, the father of my child, the person I had trusted with everything. He deserves better than a father who lies. The words landed like a final blow. Brian's shoulders sagged, his breath shuddering out of him. I saw it in his face, the moment he knew there was no coming back from this. And then, just as quickly, the panic turned to something else. Fear. Not fear of losing me, not fear of losing our family. Fear of what this would do to him. I let the silence stretch again, let him feel it. And then I delivered the final truth, the one that stripped away whatever illusion he was still clinging to. "If you refuse to sign the papers, I will destroy the career you love more than this family." His eyes snapped to mine, widening. "You wouldn't? You think I won't?" I cut in, my voice eerily calm. "I built your image as much as you did, Brian. I stood beside you and made you look like the perfect husband, the perfect father. I can tear that down just as easily. If you try to fight me, if you refuse to end this quietly, I will make sure the world knows exactly who you are." He opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind was racing, running through the possible outcomes, calculating the damage. I could see the moment he realized that I wasn't bluffing. No more speeches, no more rehearsed lines, just silence. No screaming, no violence, just cold, brutal honesty. The end of everything. I turned away, walking toward the stairs, my steps steady, my heartbeat no longer frantic. I had grieved the death of our marriage in that hospital room. Now I was just laying it to rest. Tomorrow, I will be free. Morning light crept through the curtains, casting soft shadows against the bedroom walls. The house was quiet, eerily so, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, staring at the skyline beyond the city. Today was the day I signed away a decade of my life. The day I officially severed the ties that had once bound me to a man I thought I knew. Downstairs, Brian was already awake. I could hear him pacing in the living room, the subtle creak of the floorboards betraying his restless movements. He hadn't slept, neither had I. But unlike him, I wasn't dreading this moment. I made my way down, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors. He was standing near the fireplace, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes tired, face drawn. On the coffee table, the divorce papers sat in a neat stack, the weight of them heavy even in silence. He looked up as I approached. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. I took a seat across from him, reached for the pen, and signed my name. Margot Laurent. With those 2 words, I closed the chapter of my life that had once seemed unbreakable. Brian hesitated before doing the same. His signature was slower, almost reluctant, but he knew there was no other choice. When he placed the pen down, his hands trembled slightly. And just like that, it was over. By noon, I had full custody of Ethan. Brian didn't fight me on it. Maybe he knew he had no case, or maybe he was too consumed with salvaging what was left of his public image. Either way, he let me go without resistance, and for that, I was grateful. I left the courthouse without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter, as if the weight that had been pressing on my chest for years had finally lifted. The sun was shining, but I barely noticed. I only felt the stillness, the quiet certainty that I had done the right thing. For the first time in 10 years, I was free. The fallout came fast. At first, the rumors were nothing more than whispers. Subtle shifts in conversation, curious glances, and a few speculative articles questioning why Brian had missed an event he was scheduled to attend. Then it spread. Fans began noticing small details and inconsistencies in his carefully crafted persona. Why had he stopped posting family pictures? Why was Margot missing from his public life? And then, the inevitable. Someone leaked the truth. It wasn't me. I never spoke about it, never gave a statement, never fueled the fire. But someone did. Maybe a journalist who caught wind of the whispers. Maybe someone inside Brian's circle who had been waiting for his downfall. Suddenly, the man who had built his career on being the perfect husband, the devoted father, was being scrutinized under a different lens. His fans, the same people who had adored him, began to question everything. The headlines came in waves. America's favorite MC, not so perfect after all? Betrayal behind the mic, Brian Lawrence scandal. I watched it unfold from a distance, detached, unaffected. I wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want to see him suffer. I only wanted to move on. I packed my things without urgency. There was no rush now, no chaos, just the quiet process of reclaiming my space. The house, once filled with the echoes of a life we had built together, now felt like a museum of memories I no longer wanted to keep. I took what belonged to me, what belonged to Ethan. The rest, I left behind. On my last night in that house, I stood in the empty bedroom, running my fingers along the edge of the dresser. This had been my home. This had been my life. But it wasn't mine anymore. I turned off the lights and walked out the door. I didn't look back. The air was crisp, the morning sun casting long shadows against the pavement as I stepped out of the house for the last time. My suitcase rolled beside me, the wheels humming softly against the concrete. It was strange how quiet everything felt, how final. Behind me, Brian stood in the doorway. He wasn't speaking, wasn't calling after me. He was just watching. There had been a time when I would have turned back, when I would have second-guessed myself, looked into his eyes, searched for the man I once loved. But that woman, the one who sought reassurance, who believed in the weight of shared memories, was gone. So this time, I didn't turn around. I walked to the car, placed my suitcase in the trunk, and slipped into the driver's seat. The house loomed behind me, a monument of what once was, of a life that had crumbled from the inside out. Brian took a step forward as if he wanted to say something, as if words might change the inevitable. But there was nothing left to say. I pulled out of the driveway without looking back. The city stretched before me, familiar yet different. I had driven these roads 1,000 times, but today they felt new. For 10 years, my life had been intertwined with Brian's. Every decision, every plan, every moment had been shared. I had been a wife first, a mother second, and somewhere in between, I had tried to hold on to myself. But now, there was no more us. There was only me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't have a grand plan, no perfect vision of what came next. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I pulled into my mother's driveway, the house warm and inviting under the golden morning light. Ethan would still be asleep, curled up in the familiar comfort of his grandmother's home. I stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the air. My mother sat at the kitchen table, a knowing look in her eyes. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply poured me a cup of coffee and pushed it toward me. I sat down, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the mug, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A week passed, then 2. The world moved on, as it always did. Brian's face still flashed across television screens, but the headlines had shifted. His fans debated, speculated, and whispered about the man behind the microphone. Some defended him and clung to the image he had crafted so carefully. Others saw through the cracks and questioned the reality of what they had believed. I stayed silent. I didn't need to justify my choices, didn't owe anyone an explanation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about closing a door that should have been shut long ago. I focused on Ethan, on rebuilding a life that was ours alone. At night, after he had fallen asleep, I would sit on the porch, the night air cool against my skin, and think about everything that had led me here. I had loved Brian. I had believed in him, in us. I had given him my trust without hesitation. But love can forgive. Trust, once broken, it never returns. The last remnants of my old life faded quietly. The house was sold. The papers were finalized. One afternoon, as I packed the last of my things into boxes, I came across an old photograph. Our wedding day. I stared at it for a long moment, tracing the edges of the past, the version of myself who had once stood beside him, eyes filled with hope. Then, without hesitation, I placed it at the bottom of the box and sealed it shut. Some memories weren't meant to be displayed. Some belonged to a chapter already closed. I stepped outside, the weight of the past finally lifting. For the first time, I wasn't Margot, Brian's wife. I was just Margot. And that was enough. I walked forward, stronger than before. Without him, I used to think leaving meant failure, that walking away from a marriage, from a life built over a decade, meant I had given up too soon. But I was wrong. Leaving wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing myself. For years, I had convinced myself that love was enough, that love could withstand anything, even betrayal. But love without trust is nothing more than a hollow promise, a beautifully wrapped lie. And I refused to live in a lie any longer. The hardest part wasn't signing the papers or packing my things. It wasn't even facing Brian and seeing the man I once loved turn into a stranger. No, the hardest part was learning to love myself again, to stop measuring my worth by the role I played in someone else's life. Walking away wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A chance to rebuild, to rediscover who I was outside of being a wife, outside of being a woman bound to a love that had long since died. Trust, once broken, never returns. But self-worth, that's something I could reclaim. And I did. So I left, not for revenge, not out of anger, but because I deserved better. Because I deserved to be whole. Because walking away wasn't just about leaving him, it was about finally choosing me.